Let's see, are we testing 1, 2, 1, 2? Yeah. Thanks, and thank you for coming to the Secret History of Women in Comics panel. I like the word secret because it implies we're going to reveal something, so hopefully a lot of it's well-known, and we're going to be more well-known. And my name is Heidi MacDonald. I am the editor of The Beat and the co-editor of PW Comics World and the graphic novel review editor for Publishers Weekly. And we have an awesome panel here today. To my right, we have Diane Noomin, who is, has an anthology of her work coming out, Glitz to Glow. She is the pioneering editor of women's comics and the Twisted Sisters anthologies and many other wonderful things which she will talk to us about. Next to her we have Alexa Dickman, who is the author of the Tumblr blog Ladies Making Comics and also the Women in Comics Wiki. And there's a lot to talk about that. And next to her we have Robyn Chapman, who is the editor, librarian, cartoonist, such things as True Porn, Hey 4 Eyes, and now you're working for Graphic Universe. And finally we have Jessica Abel, who is the author of such books as La Perdida and also an instructor at SBA and Adventures in Cartooning. I'm like, no, yes.
Drawing words, writing pictures.
Drawing words and writing pictures, and so please welcome our panel. So I thought I would start with a tiny preamble to say that I hate women in comics panels, but sometimes when there is an awesome topic, you get cool people to talk about it, and they all have to be women. So I consider that on this. And what I really wanted to talk about was there's so much attention right now on women in comics because there's more women in comics than ever, which is amazing. But there's also a lot of people from the past, and I don't think the history has quite been as illuminated as much as it could be. And Alexa, your wiki of women in comics was sort of like, I was looking at it, and I was like, whoa, I never heard of her. And she was like, you know, did all this stuff. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit maybe about influences and history and people we like and where we're going and other stuff like that. So, I'll start with Diane, because you are such a pioneer. But when you were starting out as a cartoonist, who were your heroes? Did you know there were other women cartoonists that you looked to? I mean, were they an influence, or, you know, how did...
I think my, you know, I like Little Lulu. That was maybe, I don't know, can you hear me okay? No? Yes? Okay. I don't think that had anything to do with why I wanted to do comics. It was more like falling into it at a time when you could draw something, you know, sideways and get it published. It was the early 70s, and women's comics was just starting up, and that was, it was a really great time in a lot of ways, but the collective aspect was not so great. So I was in women's comics for a short time, and then I started Twisted Sisters with Aileen Kaminski, who is now Aileen Kaminski Crumb. And that kind of that was like 1976. There was a lot of other comics, you know, that were going on, and they were not women's comics. They were Young Lust and Short Order and a whole bunch of comics you probably never heard of. And then in 1990, I decided, actually Aileen and I decided to do an anthology of women cartoonists because we felt like people didn't know who the women cartoonists were. I think it's something that people decide every you know, decade or so, that there are all these great women cartoonists, nobody knows about them. And so I put them all in, all the ones that I thought were great, in the Twisted Sisters anthology called Bad Girl Art, and got it published by Penguin. So it went out into shopping malls, and it was a really big thrill to not be in the underground. And suddenly people were discovering, it was all reprints, and people were saying, oh, we didn't know there were so many great cartoonists. And they had been in women's comics and in Weirdo, and then a spotlight was put on them. And it's actually sort of shocking to me to think that a lot of people now have no idea who these women are. So I'll talk about that some more later.
I'm going to skip around a little bit because we're going to go a little chronologically. So, Jessica, you probably broke in around the time this book was being published, right? Oh, with Twisted Sister?
Yeah, I got the Twisted Sisters 2, I believe, the big, it's a big fat volume. And I actually, as I was sort of starting to do comics and figure out the world of comics, which was obviously a much more difficult thing to do than it is now, I came across some old issues of women's comics. I mean, I don't know if you guys even realize that when Diane's talking about women's comics, she's talking about an actual book with the title Women's Comics. Like, it was an anthology title. And I found a bunch of those in back issue bins and comic book stores, and I then would seek them out. I would look for them. And there's definitely a way in which I didn't necessarily look to those comics as a model. A lot of the stuff that was in these anthologies, because the style that I was working in and they were working in was really different. But I did look to the fact that they existed as a model, and that they'd gotten together and done this stuff. And I certainly remember in the early 90s, as I was getting started, being highly aware of my female colleagues, the other women who were my age and a little bit older who were doing comics, and trying to kind of like enumerate ourselves and bond a little bit. And I knew that there were a few women working in other areas of comics I didn't really know about, but within sort of my crowd, and people were doing stuff that was similar, there was definitely a sense of sticking together.
Were there any female cartoonists that you looked to as artistic inspirations in that way, or?
Julie Doucet was a big influence early on. She's not that much older than me, but she's enough older that she was being published as I was discovering what I liked, and discovering comics. I don't think my work is anything like hers. I mean, I don't show the influence at all. But she was a very important figure to me.
But maybe more just as the fact that she was a woman who was getting attention, more than artistically, like you're saying.
Yeah, but I was in a stage in my sort of late teens and early 20s. I was reading this stuff that everything just kind of, when you have an influence at that phase, I think it's a really important, impressionable place, in your artistic career. That later on you're less influenceable, And at that early stage, I think I really was. And I remember doing a few pages that were when I was in college for my thesis project that were specifically influenced by Julie. Like I intentionally was like, okay, this is my Julie Doucet page, because there was a project that had all these different styles in it, and so different scenes or different characters with different styles associated with them. So I sort of tried to ape that style. And I think there's something about her her intensively creative kind of how the world came alive, and the objects were walking around, and the sort of interesting junkiness of space that definitely influenced me early on. I mean, if you look at my really early comics, you see just a lot of, I think things were coming alive, but there's just a lot of sort of atmosphere in the scenes, a lot of stuff there that was setting the stage. And that's sort of like a cross between, I think, a little bit of Julie Doucet and a lot of Jaime Hernandez.
Robyn, how about you? You came along a little bit after, and how were you influenced by women cartoonists, or how was your perception of that aspect?
Well, I guess I became aware of comics in the late 90s, and at first I really wasn't aware of any female cartoonists. It wasn't really till I went through a 4-year program in cartooning where there weren't very many women in the programs, there weren't any women teachers. But it's when I came to a convention like this, I went to, well, it's actually San Diego was the first convention where I was selling my comics, that I met other women cartoonists, and that moment was really a turning point for me. That year I met Gabrielle Bell and Ariel Schrack and a cartoonist named Amanda Padilla, who I don't think is producing work anymore, but does really wonderful work. And it was such a wonderful moment to realize, oh, there's other women making comics, making good comics, and they have good taste in comics. Like we could share, we could discuss. We were talking about how much we liked Peep Show, and I'd never really had that conversation with a woman before. So that was that was a really great moment, but it kind of took me getting into the community before I was aware of these other women in it.
Now, Alexa, you are not a cartoonist, but you have a Tumblr blog. So
Yes,
tell us
I am
about
a
how you are a lawyer in training.
Well, I'm a law student,
A
yeah.
law student.
I'm in my 3rd year, last year, thank God.
But so how did you decide to do a ladies making comics Tumblr?
Comics have been basically my primary hobby since I was about 16, when I started reading Sandman. And, you know, going into the theme of women in comics, that's pretty much probably my first real exposure as well, because Jill Thompson and Colleen Doran did work. But even when I was younger, I was obsessed with newspaper comics, and there was a while there where I was reading Brenda Starr. I didn't care who was drawing it, but now I know it was June Brakeman, and I really loved her work. But yeah, I just decided to do the blog because just all my friends were making Tumblrs, and I was like, well, I want to do something. I want to do something with comics, and it just seemed like a niche that wasn't really there yet. And then it just sort of exploded. I got a lot of followers, and you know, I got really into, you know, doing it, and it sort of then expanded into this whole wiki project because every Fridays I would post a profile of a professional cartoonist, usually contemporary, sometimes, you know, further in the past. But then one day I was reading, or skimming through David Haydew's The 10-Cent Plague, which was all about the hysteria following like the Dr. Wortham Seduction of the Innocent book and all that. And so if you haven't read it, you should. It's really good. And in the back, and he added an appendix where he listed all of the creators he could find, just any names he could find, of creators who no longer worked in comics after the Senate hearings and after the big scare. And it struck me how many women were on that list. There were about 120 of them. And it was a long list. There was probably about 800 people on that list. But the fact that there were over 100 women working in comics in the 30s and 40s and 50s was just something that, you know, hadn't really occurred to me before. It was one of those things that was in the back of my mind, well, sure, if you get that many people in a business, you know, even in that era, some of them would have to be women. But the fact that there were so many of them, and then the more research I did into them, you know, many of them were incredible artists and were pretty prominent, you know, and that of course led me to Trina Robbins' books. And so I just decided, you know, I don't have the time to do all of this research myself, but wouldn't it be nice if there was a place where we could just kind of collectively, you know, I was crowdsourcing basically, was my idea, was to crowdsource the issue and say, let's get these names out there and get people interested in interacting with, you know, the whole history of women in comics.
Wow. And there is a listing for Diane in there, actually.
Yes, there is. I actually added that in preparation for this.
Well, I mean, that is mind-boggling that, you know, there were 100 names in this list out of 800. I mean, even 1 in 8 is like, I mean, certainly in the mainstream comics, way better than we have now. I mean, why, I think Trina's books are kind of like, she went back and found all these.
I'd like to talk about Trina.
Yeah, well, okay, let's, you know, have you read Trina's books? What do you think of them, Diane?
Yeah. Well, one of the, I hope that she's accurate about the past cartoonists. I know that in terms of the present cartoonists, or her generation of cartoonists, basically, according to my friend Phoebe Gleckner, who's a very talented cartoonist that some of you hopefully have heard of, she tried to write me out of the history of women cartoonists. So that's one of the secrets you can find out. So I actually have no idea how accurate a picture she portrayed of the past generation. I assume it was probably accurate because there's no reason to be biased. But based on women's comics history and women's comics collective history, there was reason to be biased. And
did Doris Seda make it in that book?
excuse me?
Did Doris Seda make it into that book?
Into the
Because
history of women cartoonists?
yeah.
I don't know. She was in Twisted Sisters.
Right, because, you know, I've heard this edited, you know, Trina editing, I'm Joyce Brown.
I know. Hi, Joyce.
This Trina editing People Out story before, and with other people, so I don't doubt what you're saying, and I just wondered if, you know, Dory made it out.
I have a letter from Dory where she became the editor of this, I think it was Women's Comics number 11, and she asked me to do the cover, which was an incredibly brave thing for her to do because I had been basically on the Women's Comics shit list, and which was basically Trina Robyn shit list. And she wrote me that she felt she was being, she was taking a real chance, and she knew Trina was going to be upset, but she was going to do it. And you know, it's all very sad when you think about it. Dory was one of the best cartoonists I've ever known. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dory Seda.
Let me ask the room here, like, how many people have ever heard of Dory Seda in this room? Okay, so there's like, you know, about 10 people, 12 people out of here. And she was a very, you know, prominent cartoonist in the underground era, and her stuff was absolutely great. I mean, it was vibrant and, you know, hilarious and brave. And she has, like, I mean, not to be too, you know, TMZ about it, but she had this really sad story, tragic life, where she died because she had no health insurance and had, like, kind of drank a lot. And
she died in a car accident, and she got pneumonia.
Right.
Yeah.
See, because what I remember is when Dory died, Trina set up to create a Dory Seda Award for Women in Comics, which was administered 1 year.
Yeah.
And this really offended. I sat at a table with all of Dory's friends, her boyfriend, with Critter, her best friend, and they were all terribly upset and unhappy about this because they felt, quote, that Trina had deliberately maneuvered to keep Dory out of different women's comics projects. And yet here she was writing this one of our own has fallen thing. And I don't think there was ever a Dory Seda Award after that, but you know, as somebody who's vulnerable right now because of my husband Harvey Picard dying and having people trying to appropriate his name, you know, I can't help but bring that up. And you know, you're not the only one on Trina's shit list.
Well, you know, I would like to, you know, bring this up in a way because Trina Robbins has written 2 books, co-written, one she co-wrote with Ironwood and another she wrote herself, which are kind of the only books out there about women cartoonists.
I think there's 3, because there's Girls to Girls, there's the more recent women's history, and then there's the, like, I think the superhero one. Basically, she's written the books that are out there.
And I mean, like, you can, I mean, obviously there are issues, severe issues with it, but I really feel like, I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but I mean, has anyone else written about the history of women in comics and, you know, these 100 women and these, you know, history of women's comics? I mean,
well, that was one of the things I really liked about David Haydu's book was he made a point, not exactly made a point, but the fact was he mentioned them. Like, there are so many histories of comics that just barely mention women at all, even if they were very prominent. Like even, you know, Men of Tomorrow, the Steranko history, just maybe in passing we'll mention 1 or 2 names, but you know, Haydu, and partly because a lot of the Golden Age creators who are still around are women, you know, because women have longer lifespans in general, but just because those are the people around to interview. So, I mean, he opens the book with a conversation with Janice Vallot, who I believe worked for Fiction House, because most women work for Fiction House, or maybe she worked for Quality. But yeah, so that was one of the things that I actually wrote to him, kind of thanked him about that, just to say that they were part of the Golden Age, and to act like they weren't was, you know, to write them out is not really that important, especially because a lot of them were really good. And like I was saying, Fiction House was this publisher that hired a lot of women cartoonists, and they were a pretty big company back in the day. So it's basically writing out a whole company, not just the women.
Well,
so.
What's interesting also, I mean, just to give an example, and like with everybody in comics is always talking about this Iger Eisner studio, which was Jerry Iger and Will Eisner, and they were a packaging company and they produced a lot of comics. And then Eisner left to do his own Spirit stuff, but the Iger studio continued, and his wife, Ruth Roche, was, you know, the co-publisher and co-ran the studio and wrote a lot of the books. And, you know, it wasn't the Iger Roche studio. So, I mean, I think there's kind of a lot of forgotten women, which is
well, one of the nice things about what Alexi's saying with the Haydu book is that it's, and this is what I didn't know, Heidi, you and I have talked about before, it's like basically we want to have this, we want to not have this panel anymore because because the history of women comics is kind of incorporated into all the rest of the history books, and it's just there as part of the thing. It's like, I'm glad that the Trina and Robyn's books exist. I'm glad that your blog exists. It's a really good idea to have these things highlighted, but it's also great then to say, all right, well now we're going to write a history of Golden Age comics, so let's make sure that the 1/8% of creators who were women, if that's really what the numbers were, that's what we represent in the pages of the book. I mean, it doesn't have to be highlighted like, more than the actual representation, but equal to the representation in some sense. Even if the top named people were not women, I mean, we know that there are reasons for that that don't necessarily have to do with their work.
Well, the problem with that is, that's like an idealized view.
Oh, I know. I'm saying this is the ideal, this is what we would love, and
work.
which is why it's nice to see, at least in one book, that that's what seems to have happened.
Diane, let me talk a little bit about when, women's comics were starting. And I mean, it was part of this whole underground comics scene, and I mean, how did it fit in with the rest of the scene? I mean, how was it received among the male cartoonists?
I think, people pretty much judged comic books on the content. I didn't care in that sense if it was women's comics or Insect Fear or Young Lust. It was just a comic book. You either liked it or didn't. The women's comics were an anthology. And a big problem with them was that the editor was sort of a quasi-editor, and she had to please Trina. And so she did all the shit work, and Trina said yes or no. And then it was like very uneven because of that. People got in because they were somebody's friend or because they wanted to encourage a new cartoonist, and so you would have very strong work and boring work, in my opinion. And so when I put the Twisted Sisters together, I picked all the strong work, I thought. And one thing I'd like to do, just for the hell of it, is to name the women cartoonists that were collected in the first Twisted Sisters collection called Collection of Bad Girl Art. And I might not remember them all, but...
I actually have a copy with me, so...
Okay, and we can hold it up. In my slideshow, I'm going to talk about it. But okay, so I can tell you who these people are. Phoebe Gleckner, Dory Seda, Aileen from Carol Mosevich, myself, Christine Critter, Leslie Sternberg, M.K. Brown, Mary Fleener, Carol Lay, Penny Moran Van Horn, whose work is incredibly strong and wonderful if you've never seen it.
She's great.
Scratchboard, very powerful stories. Karen Leshen, Carol Tyler, and Julie Doucet.
And I mean, that's amazing.
And that is really a powerful lineup of women cartoonists, and so it's very disheartening to me to hear that you didn't know there were other women cartoonists, like maybe 8 years after this came out, And
I was a teenager, so my access to...
I'm just saying in general. I'm glad that there were other... I felt somehow that by doing this, it would encourage other women cartoonists to know there was this community of really talented women,
I think it does, and it did, and it does, and it continues to. And the fact that there's, that the Trina books are there, and that your blog is there, and whatever, it creates this increased, awareness over time, and there's an accretion of kind of information. But I do feel like, and I felt like this my whole kind of career, like I was aware of women cartoonists pretty early relative to you in terms of my career. Like I found them earlier than you did, which maybe is because these books were coming out about that time. In fact, I do have both of these. I didn't just get the second one. But so yeah, I mean, I found that one the other day, but I know I have the other one somewhere. But anyway, I found these pretty early. I found them when I was in my late teens or early 20s, and women's comics as well. And maybe they're not as available now. Like this sort of, there was a whole trend in the 90s for women's anthologies in the mini comic scene. And there were a lot of all-women things. There was Action Girl, which I think was really important for a lot of young women cartoonists. And there was an anthology called, a one-issue anthology called On Our Butts, which is a riff on Our Backs. Right? And there were others, a bunch of others that came out at the time. And I actually complained at the time. There was this question of like, what is it like to be a woman in comics, like comes up. It always comes up. It's always come up, and maybe a little less so now than it used to, but it definitely has been a continuous sort of part of like interviews and talk. And I remember being asked that question in the 90s, and I was being published by Fantagraphics, and I felt like I'd gotten, my mini comics had gotten attention in the Comics Journal, and people were, knew who I was, and I was invited to, festivals and things. But then I would look at anthologies that were coming out, the really high-profile anthologies at the time, and there were almost no women in them ever, and they were all women anthologies that were coming out. But then the other ones were like just anthologies, not men's anthologies, and yet there were no women in them still. And so I just felt like there's this kind of weird disconnect between the way I felt when I was at a place like SPX in the 90s, and everybody's welcoming and interested in what I'm doing and all this stuff, and then somehow that didn't translate into, I mean, not just for me, but for the other women who were working also, into actual, like making it into these sort of inner circle publications.
Well, let me throw this out to the panel. I mean, you feel like there are some Harold Blooms in comics? Who Harold Bloom is like, famous for the white male curriculum of writers. And, does that exist in comics in some sense?
I think it exists all throughout the society. You're going to have an adjective unless you're that. You can have...
You're not just a cartoonist,
you
you're
can
a
be
cartoonist.
A black cartoonist, be in an anthology of black cartoonists, because you're not a white Anglo-Saxon male. And maybe that would have black women and men, I don't know. But if you're a woman, it's very hard. I mean, I have been in anthologies that were mixed.
Oh yeah, no, I have too, plenty. But I'm just saying, there was a real disconnect in sort of.
But I don't know about losing the adjective. I just don't know if that's going to happen. I mean, if you're written about in a newspaper, in whatever field, if you're Lee Krasner, you're going to be the less well-known wife of Jackson Pollock. That's just the way it works.
Is there any way to change that?
I suppose there's ways to change it. I mean, I just have enough energy to do my work and hopefully get it published and get people to see it, and I'm not trying to change the world. I did have that question come up all the time about why are there all women in there, and why aren't there any gay women in there, and I had to say, I don't care who you sleep with, I don't care.
I guess what I was trying to say a minute ago, and I got myself off track, is that I feel like every generation of women cartoonists, young women cartoonists, women into comics, go through a period of like you're talking about, you meet a few other women, you find some books, and you do this sort of exploration. You're like, oh wait, there actually are other people doing this who are women, and that's great. And it's reinforcing, and even if you leave it behind as a central interest, that it doesn't matter to you that much whether your favorite cartoonists are women or men. There's a period where it does matter. There's a period where you're like, this is really important to notice. And
well, Robyn, you were working at CCS, the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont, and I mean, what about because that has, I mean, the classes are small, but I mean, what's the male-female ratio up there?
It's different every year, and it's such a, we bring in a class of maybe 20 students a year, so it is a very small case study, but it has definitely, the percentage has gone up. I haven't met this new class that just started this week, so I can't speak to that class, but the last couple of classes have been 50%, and I think even one was like a little more than 50%, which may not sound like too startling of a ratio, but it is really pretty high for comics. Though, compared to other cartooning programs, it's at least 5 years ago, and Jessica, you could probably speak to this more, when manga was really big. I feel like the wave has crested, and this might not be true anymore, but when manga was just booming, there was so many more young women in like at SVA and other college level programs. So would you say?
yeah, I think that's when we saw the big explosion of female students. Like when I started, I've been at SVA for about 10 years now. When I started at SVA, there were women in my class from the beginning, but it was like I'd have a class of 15 and 5 of them would be women, say, or 4 of them or something like that. This year I have a class of 20, my new sophomore class, and 15 of them are women. And I don't know if that actually is representative of the class, of the structure, like the entire cartooning class, because it's a fairly large program and I don't see everybody, But in my junior class, I think it's like 60% as well, women versus men. And I think that the program's about at least 50-50, maybe a little bit more women than men now. And that's new in the last, like, say, couple of years. Which is interesting because the manga wave has crested and it's like people's interests are much more various now than they were, 5 years ago. Everybody was like, naming these manga I'd never heard of, and when you ask them what their favorite work is, they're talking about all these different things. And I just did, I just had my first class this week with my sophomores, and their list of like, what's your top comic from the last 3 months? Because I don't ask top ever. I'm like, what are you into right now? It was like everything from Batman, who was a woman, by the way, to like paying for it, another woman, and everything in between. I mean, everything in between, and a couple of web comics, a couple people into manga, just everywhere. And it was way wider. It was a way wider range than usual. So I'm really looking forward to this year to see what it's like.
Great. Is there any questions out there for our panel? Anybody have questions? Yeah.
I've been burning with this one. Can you talk about the effect of the internet on women in cartooning and comics? Because from what I'm seeing, the internet represents a wide open marketplace that wasn't available before. Would you just comment on some of that?
I think that's true. I mean, I think that in my formative years, the internet didn't exist. And I had mini comics, and you would trade mini comics through the mail, so you were finding stuff that way. And so there was kind of a way of discovering stuff, but there's definitely like, it felt secret. You go into a store and you dig through some back bins or like look behind some other issues and you'd find something and you wouldn't know where it came from or what it was connected to. And there's kind of no way to find out, where now you just Google it and find out who these people are. And I really think that if you're a young woman interested in comics and you Google like women in comics, you're going to find Alexa's blog like the second or third hit down probably. You can even just go to Wikipedia and you click, if you find one person, there's a listing in there of women in comics, and you could go and find it. So the access to information for all kinds of subcultures like that is really great. And also, presenting your work, you're kind of on a level playing field in a way that you never were before. It's like it's about who you know, people linking to you and whatever. And women are just as friendly, or maybe more so than men. So,
Alexa,
yeah. No, and the best thing about the internet is that there's no content restriction. There's not no one will, even if the art is really good. If you go to even the smaller companies and the more indie companies, they will look at your work and say, sorry, this isn't right for us. And the best thing about the internet is that doesn't matter. You just put it out there and you let the audience come to you. It's not trying to go through a middleman of having somebody else trying to get their audience to read your work. It's that way. And so that's where I think you get people like Kate Beaton. Which publisher can you really think of would have, or newspaper syndicate would have picked up just scribbly little history joke comics, or literature joke, and she is now probably one of the biggest cartoonists today. And that's because she had the internet available to her, which is
and because she did great work and people talked about it,
right?
And that's really.
I think it just gives you a gateway. I run a blog that covers all comics news, but this is obviously a topic that's pretty important to me. So I do put a lot of women in comics stuff on there, and somebody said I had given a statistic about how SPX was 40% women as exhibitors. And somebody in the comments was like, well, I hope now all your blog is going to be 40% about women. And I'm like, well, first off, you haven't been reading my blog. Because a lot of times I'll just link to a cartoonist, and I don't say it's a woman cartoonist. There's that adjective in there. And I find that's very powerful. And, plus 100% of it is by a woman, because I wrote it, So, anyway, but yeah, Joyce, you had a question.
Yeah, it's another question about women in comics and the internet. You said gateway. Okay, women can put their comics on the internet. You're self-excluded. How do you feel about the way that women in comics are publicized, promoted, written about, critiqued by bloggers, magazines, online journalists? Because to me, that's the missing components, not just that you can get in the door and put yourself up. I want to know about promotion and presentation. Is there a lag there, or do you think that the gap has closed? I mean, Heidi, I know I can count on you, right? But what about, what are your experiences with, how do you think the critics and the advocates and the bloggers and the magazines are doing in terms of receiving and rewarding and promoting women's topics?
I would say, well, for one thing, to me there's always been more of a disconnect between print comics and web comics, and that's only getting bigger because web comics are doing much better, in my opinion. And also the big comic book news sites like Newsarama and Comic Book Resources and whatnot, they are as dependent on the big two, on Marvel and DC, and even some of the smaller companies, because they are also trying to get people to come to them, and because they need to keep the site running, and so they need the money from the ad revenue, and they need the 70% of the industry to get people interested in their content. So I think there is a bit of a disconnect there, whereas webcomics have basically their own communities set up. They have they have their own convention, the New England Webcomics Weekend. Probably the biggest, and it's only in its third year, but it's it's an event, and it's just that there's kind of a disconnect in terms of just what is considered big news. People tend to report mostly on the quote unquote big news, whereas at least from my more limited experience, just promoting women's work, a lot of times I will get people writing in, because every Monday I'll post what's coming out that week, at least from the diamond shipping list, and by women, and so many times I'll get people, just leaving a little note saying, this is incredible, how come I haven't heard of this anywhere else? I don't think it's, strictly on gender lines, but I think, just like Diane was saying, just the way society is set up, that the women aren't necessarily getting as big a press as, say, a man might, especially if they're dealing with certain topics. There's a book out there that I haven't had a chance to read entirely, but it's called How to Suppress Women's Writing, and it's totally tongue-in-cheek. It's by Joanna Russ, who's also a really good science fiction author, and it's written as sort of like this guidebook for aliens. And it's basically talking about how women's writing throughout history is kind of downplayed, because, either she, like people talk about, oh, Zelda Fitzgerald, well, she's F. Scott's wife, and even though he probably, stole half the Great Gatsby from her, people don't really talk about her, or Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre was basically her only novel, and so people say, well, she only wrote one of them. Or, oh, look what she wrote about.
It's the new hurdle.
Yeah.
The hurdles, like, as soon as you do something good, it's like, oh, but you didn't do it like that guy.
Right. Yeah. So if you write about women's experience, if you write about the home, if you write about children, people will be like, well, yeah, she wrote that because she's a woman, but it's not real. It's not real art because it's not. Even if a man then goes and writes about the same thing, it's still then that's creative.
Mm-hmm. Have you? I'll just throw this up the panel. Have you ever had your art called ugly?
Not to my face.
Because I know that was always, I grew up reading the Comics Journal, and I mean, it was like, constantly like Linda Barry. Oh, she just draws so ugly. And it's like,
draws like a girl.
oh yeah, and she draws like a girl.
Yeah. Because there's this kind of like handmade look that people would like identify with drawing like a girl, drawing like women.
Yeah.
I wanted to point out one thing. I just remembered this. This is the galley for the new Best American Comics. It's going to come out in a few weeks. Alison Bechtel, the guest edited, and it's a great one. It's a great outing here. But she does this really funny thing about women in comics in her introduction, where she talks about, and she specifically set out to like consider comics by women, and she did not give them preference, but she like noted, okay, this is a comic by women, and she's the first guest editor who's created a spreadsheet for her choices. I love Alison Bechtel. Both artistically and personally. But so she's been, one of her columns was gender, sex, actually, but you know what I'm saying. And then they, so she counted up, you know, and then she went through all the previous Best Americans and counted up how many women there were in all of them, and it almost never cracks 30%, and hers is about, you know, 26 or 27% or something like that. And she just kind of wants to, she outlines it. And she basically says what I said earlier about like wanting to not have to pay attention to this, and yet you have to. And she does, and she launches the volume Manifestation by Gabrielle Bell, which you guys probably, some of you will have seen. It's her story where she pretends that she was hired to adapt the Scum Manifesto. So it's like a lot about women and women's voices, and you know, it's very funny. And so she started off with that intentionally to be like, let's look at these issues. So it should be interesting to talk about with you.
Question in the back, yeah. Oh.
I want to follow up on that. You brought up Joanna West.
Yes.
Who wanted to kind of run a theme that sort of you're saying comics have made in the last few minutes is that you being considered a cartoonist rather than a woman cartoonist. And I'm not a cartoonist, my background is in fiction. And it isn't really an either or in literature. Writers are both women writers and just plain writers. And the gender identity is a lens through which you examine their work, not necessarily an essential property of their work. So a writer like Joanna Russ, the idea of women writers, of a woman's voice and a woman's writing, is a terribly empowering thing for her. She's a tremendously token and feminist writer. I'm wondering about that sort of sense that I don't like the idea of the women being erased from, so that everybody becomes a cartoonist without a gender. I think that the feminine woman's voice is very powerful, very interesting, and when you have collections of women's work, you see different things coming out of that work than you do when you put those women in conversation with men, because our culture is gendered and our experiences are women. Can you speak a little bit to sort of this idea that not having your gender matter is the ideal, rather than simply having your gender not be a liability to you?
You mean it's okay to be a woman cartoonist? Is there a world? Is that possible, girls?
I'd like to think so. You know, I agree. I agree that it is, you know, it is part of our experience. It is sort of basically the Harold Bloom problem, you know, is, you know, it's not so much a matter of, oh, she wrote this, but she did it wrong. It's, she wrote it, but that's right. You know, she wrote it in the right way. And so, yeah, but you do get, you know, like the Harold Blooms of the world saying, I remember in college, I took a class called Early Women Writers, which were all pre-1700 women novelists and short story writers and poets and whatnot. It was really an interesting class. And one of my favorite books from that class was Orinoco by Aphra Behn. And this is when I really started to hate Harold Bloom, because I came across an essay where he was talking about how, oh, you know, forcing, you know, diversity and that, yeah, and what are we going to replace, you know, are we going to replace Shakespeare with Aphra Behn? And I'm like, you did not just insult Aphra Behn.
Oh man, I'm not sure this is quite on your topic, but just, you know, my mother was a cartoonist and, you know, an artist, and I mean, I grew up watching her draw, and that's how I became, like, you know, my grandmother read Little Lulu, you know, so I grew up in a household where women in comics were one and the same, so I had no illusions. But I mean, even just asking this panel the question, it's like none of you had a role model, like when you were becoming formative, none of you said, you know, except maybe Jessica, would Julie just say a little, like, oh, here is a woman who has done this and been successful, and I can point to her and say, she is, you know, a role model for me.
I did love Brenda Starr,
Yeah.
but I didn't know that Dale Messick was a woman.
I did too, actually. I knew she was a woman, and I did really like Brenda Starr growing up. She was in the Tribune, and I would read her every day, and I thought she was great, but not a role model.
And I mean, but that's sad. I mean, that's because there have been women doing everything. And I mean, that's just really, really sad.
Well, it's kind of sad and kind of not sad, because I mean, the point for me is I was modeling myself on Jaime Hernandez and like Dan Clowes, and they're male, but they had the career, like the way, they were working a way that I wanted to work, and I felt like there's no reason why I couldn't do it. I didn't have to have a female role model in order to do it. And I mean, I think this question that the questionnaire brought up is interesting, and it's not, and when I say that I don't want to be thought of as a woman cartoonist, I don't want to people to not know that I'm female, you know, or to be able
Which
to
Dale
look at
Messick did. She
Right.
took the name Dale, so you wouldn't know.
Right. I mean, they're definitely, and I have other friends, and you know, I have a friend who's an illustrator from Mexico, and she uses a pseudonym because she feels like it's a disadvantage to be known as a woman. So, but it's not that I don't want people to know that I'm a woman, or even to be able to look at my work through that lens. I think that's an interesting idea, that you can kind of look at somebody's work through that lens. But I also, you can look at anybody's work through the lens of their experience. You know, where did they grow up? So this guy is Southern. You know, he's a white man from Georgia. What kind of influence does that have on his work? I think it's a way to look at it through the lens of who is this artist and what does he bring to it. And being female and growing up in a certain time and place are all things that will have an influence on my work. And I think all of those things are valid ways to look at it. The problem is when it's used, like Lex is saying, as a cudgel. It's like it's dismissive, you know? Like, oh, well, you know, I mean, one of the things I think kind of find interesting about people's response to my work is people will always, often people will think that my work is all autobiographical, whereas I've actually never done a major autobiographical comic ever. And, you know, the closest I get is I do nonfiction comics where I'm an interviewer and I'm in it, you know. But they're all completely fictional, but because women's comics are, I think partly because women's comics are associated with autobiography so strongly, people assume that they're autobiographical, even when I have male protagonists, by the way, which I do sometimes.
I started out doing comics that were completely not autobiographical, hiding behind a character and using her to, you know, do whatever I wanted. Sometimes it was just satire, sometimes it was, you know, outrageous. At one point in my career, I got to the point where I have my character, whose name is Dee Dee Glitz, pulling me actually out onto the page with her so that I can, then I have this dialogue between myself as a cartoon character and my cartoon character. It's becomes this incredibly seductive thing that you can't stop doing after a while.
Breaking the fourth wall.
Breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, well, just one other point I wanted to make is Aileen Kaminski is one of the early women cartoonists in women's comics, and her major influence was Justin Green. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Justin Green. He's kind of an unsung genius of underground comics. He did this book called The Adventures of Binky Brown.
It just was released last year by Sweeney's Binky Brown. Anybody get that book?
Anybody know Justin
Brown?
And the Virgin Mary.
Binky Brown, the Holy Virgin Mary.
Yeah,
One in the
Binky
back.
Brown meets the Holy Virgin Mary.
So, we were running out of time, so maybe one more question over here, yeah?
I'm wondering that if you still think having an anthology is relevant. I mean, I've talked to some comic book store people who say, well, people don't like to publish anthologies anymore, and so are anthologies relevant besides the Best American Comics? And, of course,
I hate the Best American
and
titles.
would an anthology of women cartoonists still be relevant?
The question is anthologies. Would a woman's anthology still be relevant, Diane?
I don't understand. Are you talking about anthologies in general, or
Both
women's?
Both
women?
of those things, yeah.
I think it's a valid thing to do, and it's interesting to contrast work. I don't think you necessarily have to exclude men to have a really strong and interesting anthology, but I like the concept of having people, just as an editor, I just like the idea of, okay, I like your work, I think it'd be interesting together, I'm going to put it in a book, and somehow by showing them together and contrasting them, they gain strength. So I think it's a valid form. I don't care if it's, you know, a women, I do hate the concept of the best of anything. It just infuriates me.
Well, I didn't pick it, but I think and every guest editor apologizes for it every year. I think the main thing about anthologies is they're a lot of fun. People, and I think serious comics readers love anthologies because you can find stuff that you wouldn't see otherwise. You know, there's always like 6 things you've already read, and maybe 12 things you've never read, and maybe 3 that you really are glad you found. That's great. It's a great way to find stuff. But they've never been financially viable, ever. You know, like no publisher likes an anthology. They may want it, I mean, they may survive, but they're not going to make real money. They're not, you know.
Well, Woman Anthology just got overfunded hugely.
Right, and I think that's a cultural event more than it is like the anthology itself. Like if somebody just published Woman Anthology and put it on the shelf, I'm sure people would buy it and maybe it would break even, but it's, you know, the reason it wasn't funded by a publisher in the first place is you're like, I don't want to do an anthology, it doesn't make any money.
Well,
So it's Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Most of what I do for my personal creative work is edit anthologies, but only in the small press. And I think they still are relevant. It's an efficient, cheap way to package work and have it come out pretty regularly. And I recently did do an anthology that was women only, but it was topic-based. It was all about ex-boyfriends. And I think that's more relevant. Like, we happen to be all women because we're sharing experience, not because it's not random, I guess. So I mean, I do think the anthology format is relevant on the small press, but that's when you're really not setting out to make money in the first place.
Do people make money on the web? I have never figured out how to do that.
That's another panel.
Stick around.
Yeah, I would say just one more thing about anthologies, that at least from my experience, I enjoy them because they are fun. It is what I liked about what Woman Anthology was doing, not just in terms of just another anthology of women cartoonists. What they did was they got a bunch of professionals and then a bunch of webcomics artists and amateurs and people maybe just out of art school and sort of matched them up so that the big names were working with the smaller names. And so it was a way of, instead of just putting everyone in the same book, because you can skip stories, but if two people, if you're interested in an artist or a writer and you just are being forced to be exposed to some new person's work as well, which I really like that. But also, yeah, and like Robyn was saying about the more themed anthologies, we saw, I mean, it's published by Topatico, but Machine of Death, the prose anthology, was huge. It was #1 on Amazon for at least like on its first day, and then it even made it, as a self-published anthology, it made it into bookstores, which, I mean, doesn't count for much these days, but the point was even, Borders and Barnes & Noble were willing to put the book on the shelf because it was, the concept. If you don't know it, it's if there was a machine that told you how you were going to die, and just writing, they were all short stories based on people finding it out.
I think that short stories in particular and anthologies in general may have a new life now that ebooks are a thing, because you don't have to spend anything on printing them, and people are interested in little short bits of things and discovering them and be able to read something quickly, so that's something.
Well, with that we're on to the next thing. We must clear the room, but thank you so much for coming, and thank you.